I used to believe my life was simple and safe, and I used to say it out loud. 7 years doesn't disappear, I told Ethan one morning as he tied his shoes. He laughed and said, "You worry too much." I believed him because loving him felt like breathing. I paid half the bills, cooked late dinners, and waited when he worked overtime. That's what love is, I told myself. Sacrifice meant loyalty, and loyalty meant silence. Lena knew everything. She sat across from me at our favorite cafe and said, "You're lucky, you know that?" I smiled and stirred my coffee. "I am," I said. She squeezed my hand and replied, "I want what you have." I never noticed how her eyes lingered when Ethan texted me. I never questioned why she defended him when I complained. "Men are just bad at feelings," she said, and I nodded like a fool. At night, Ethan would pull me close and whisper, "It's always you." I would answer, "I trust you." The words felt sacred. When he came home late, he said, "Work ran long." And I said, "I understand." When my chest tightened, I blamed stress. "Don't overthink," Lena told me over the phone. "You're safe." I clung to that word. I believed being a good woman meant being patient. When my mother warned, "Don't give too much," I replied, "Love requires effort." Ethan once said, "You're too good to me," and I laughed, answering, "That's what partners do." Lena agreed, saying, "You're rare." Their praise felt warm, and I ignored how it kept me quiet. I thought endurance proved devotion. There were moments I should have questioned. Once I called Ethan and heard laughter in the background. "Who's there?" I asked. He paused and said, "Just coworkers." Later, Lena texted, "Are you okay?" I replied, "Why wouldn't I be?" She sent a heart and said, "Just checking." I told myself concern was kindness, not guilt. I told myself love didn't hide. I remember standing by the window telling myself, trust is a choice. I chose it again and again. Every time fear whispered, I answered, faith is stronger. I didn't know then how expensive faith could be. Still, small cracks appeared. Ethan stopped meeting my eyes. Lena canceled plans last minute. Once I asked, is something wrong? Ethan smiled too fast and said, nothing at all. Lena laughed and added, you're imagining things. I laughed too, even when my stomach burned. Love meant believing even when doubt knocked. The night before everything broke, I stood in our kitchen and said, do you ever feel distant? Ethan kissed my forehead and replied, you're my home. My phone buzzed and Lena texted, miss you. I typed back, always. As I turned off the lights, a strange chill crawled over me. I paused, listening to the silence, then whispered to myself, love doesn't lie. I chose to sleep, and that choice sealed my fate. I believed morning would prove me right again. I came home early that night and said out loud, Ethan, I'm home. I expected silence or maybe music. Instead, I heard laughter. A woman's laugh. I stopped and whispered, that's weird. I stepped closer and heard Ethan say, you're going to make me drop this. Lena replied, then drop it. My heart slammed. I said, Lena. My voice sounded wrong, like it didn't belong to me. I turned the corner and saw them. Ethan froze and said, wait. Lena jumped back and said, this isn't what it looks like. I laughed once and asked, then tell me what it is. Ethan opened his mouth and said, we were just talking. I pointed at their hands and said, talking doesn't look like that. Lena whispered, please don't do this. I asked, do what? See you. Ethan stepped toward me and said, I didn't mean for you to find out like this. I repeated, find out. Lena cried, I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head and said, you already did. My chest felt tight. I asked, how long? Ethan said, it just happened. I screamed, 7 years just happened? My voice cracked and I hated that they heard it. Lena said, you don't understand. I replied, explain it to me. She said, I fell for him. I laughed again and said, so did I. Ethan said, I was lonely. I asked, was I invisible? He looked away and said, you were always busy. I said, I was building a life with you. Silence answered me. I wanted to move, to throw something, to scream louder, but my body wouldn't listen. I stood there and said softly, you both promised me. Lena said, I'm sorry. Ethan said, I love you. I asked, Which one? He didn't answer. My hands shook. I said, get away from me. They didn't move. I said it again louder. Lena reached out and said, please. I stepped back and said, don't touch me. Ethan said, we can fix this. I laughed through tears and said, you broke it together. My heart felt like it was tearing. I picked up my keys and said, this is over. Ethan shouted, don't go. I replied, you already left. Ethan followed me and said, say something. I turned and said, I trusted you. Lena cried, I never meant to steal him. I answered, you stole my safety. Ethan said, I made a mistake. I replied, you made a choice. My legs felt weak but my voice stayed steady. I said, you don't get me anymore. I walked out before they could say anything else. The hallway felt endless. When I pushed the door open, rain hit my face. I stepped into it and whispered, I didn't deserve this. The rain answered nothing. My phone buzzed but I didn't look. I kept walking and told myself, breathe. Each step hurt but stopping felt worse. I said, this is real, and then, this is over. The rain soaked me but it also hid my tears. That night took everything I believed in: love, trust, and home. And I didn't know yet that I would never be the same woman again, ever. I walked forward knowing betrayal had rewritten my future, and nothing from my past could ever follow me again. I didn't sleep after that night. I lay on my bed and said, close your eyes, but my mind said, don't. I stared at the ceiling and whispered, what did I miss? The silence answered louder than any scream. My chest tightened and I sat up gasping, saying, breathe, just breathe. No one answered me. At work I kept my head down. Mara leaned over my desk and asked, are you okay? I shrugged and said, I'm fine. She studied my face and replied, you don't look fine. I said, I just need time. She nodded and said, if you want coffee, I'm here. She didn't ask why and I was grateful. At night my phone lit up. Ethan texted, please talk to me. I turned it face down and said, you lost that right. Another message came. I'm sorry. I whispered, sorry doesn't undo it. He wrote, I made a mistake. I said, you made many. I didn't send anything. Silence felt safer than words. I replayed everything. I asked myself, was I boring? Then answered, no. I asked, was I blind? And said, maybe. I remembered Lena's smile and Ethan's promises and I said, I trusted you. The thought made my stomach twist. I pressed my hand to my chest and said, I am still here. It felt like a lie but I kept saying it. Mara sat beside me during lunch and said, you don't have to explain. I looked at her and said, I don't know how to talk about it. She replied, then don't. I swallowed and said, it hurts. She nodded and answered, I know. That was enough. The panic came without warning. My heart raced and I said, something's wrong. I locked myself in the bathroom and whispered, you're safe. Tears fell anyway. I stared at my reflection and asked, who are you now? The woman staring back didn't answer. That night Ethan called. I watched the phone ring and said, I can't. When it stopped I felt both relief and pain. I sat on the floor and said, this could destroy me. Then I said, or it could change me. The words stayed with me. I sat in the dark and listened to my thoughts argue. One voice said, you failed. Another said, you loved. I asked, which one defines me? The room stayed quiet. My phone buzzed again. Ethan wrote, I can't eat or sleep. I said out loud, that's not my burden. He sent, please forgive me. I replied to the air, forgiveness isn't access. I opened our old photos and said, that girl believed. I closed them and said, this one knows. I thought about calling Lena and then said, no. I told myself, healing is choosing silence. My hands shook as I stood up. I said, I'm still standing. The words felt small but they were true. I walked to the window and whispered, tomorrow will come. Fear answered but I answered back, so will I. I added, I will learn. And the promise scared me, because learning meant pain, change, and leaving behind the version of me who begged to stay loved, even when fear told me to disappear again. Before sleeping I whispered, I will survive. I didn't know how. I only knew I had to. I sat in Mr. Harlan's office and said, "You wanted to see me?" He folded his hands and replied, "I'm offering you a temporary transfer." I blinked and asked, "A different city?" He nodded and said, "A fresh start can help." I hesitated and said, "Running won't fix me." He answered, "Sometimes distance gives clarity." I looked down and whispered, "I don't trust my decisions anymore." He said calmly, "Then let this be a professional one." I finally nodded and said, "I'll go." When I packed my bags, I told myself, "This isn't escape." My voice didn't believe me. The new apartment smelled empty. I stood in the doorway and said, "This is temporary." The walls didn't answer. I unpacked slowly and said, "No memories here." That helped me breathe. My phone buzzed with Ethan's name and I said, "Not anymore," as I turned it off. The first night I heard a knock. I froze and whispered, "Don't panic." I opened the door a crack. A man smiled gently and said, "Hi, I'm Noah. I live next door." I nodded and said, "I'm new." He replied, "I guessed." He held out a small box and added, "Your package was delivered to me by mistake." I took it and said, "Thank you." He said, "If you need anything, just knock." I answered, "Okay." He didn't ask questions and that mattered. At work, Mr. Harlan called and said, "Settling in?" I replied, "I'm functioning." He said, "That's enough for now." I laughed quietly and said, "You don't ask much." He answered, "I don't need details." I appreciated that more than sympathy. Days passed quietly. One evening, Noah saw me struggling with a box and said, "Want help?" I said too quickly, "I've got it." He stepped back and replied, "All right." His calm made me uneasy. Later I saw him again and said, "Sorry." He asked, "For what?" I said, "Being guarded." He smiled and replied, "We all are." The words stayed with me. I sat alone and asked myself, "Can I trust anyone?" My chest tightened as I answered, "Not yet." I remembered Ethan's smile and Lena's voice and said, "Never blindly again." The thought scared me. I didn't want to live armored forever. One night, Noah knocked and said, "Your light's been on for hours." I replied, "I couldn't sleep." He nodded and said, "I make tea when that happens." I hesitated and said, "I don't talk much." He answered, "Then we won't talk much." I let him in. We sat in silence. I finally said, "Thank you for not asking." He replied, "You'll speak when you're ready." My eyes burned. Later I called Mara and said, "I moved." She asked, "How do you feel?" I answered, "Unsteady but breathing." She said, "That's progress." I believed her. I lay in bed and said, "This city doesn't know me." That felt safe. I told myself, I can become someone new here. Fear whispered, "What if you fail again?" I answered, "Then I'll learn again." I stared at the ceiling and said, "I'm not healed." I paused and added, "But I'm walking." The words felt like the first step through a door I never planned to open, and I let myself stand there unsure but willing, knowing distance was teaching me how to exist without begging for love, how to breathe without permission, and how to begin again without looking back. I was leaving work when I heard my name. "Please wait." I froze. I knew that voice. I turned slowly and said, "Why are you here, Ethan?" He looked thinner and said, "I needed to see you." I replied, "You lost that right." He stepped closer and said, "I regret everything." My hands shook as I answered, "Regret doesn't rebuild trust." He whispered, "I was lonely." I laughed and said, "I was faithful." He said, "You don't understand." I replied, "I understand perfectly now." He followed me outside and said, "I miss you." I stopped and asked, "Or you miss being forgiven?" He looked away and said, "Lena and I didn't work." I felt my chest tighten. I asked, "So I'm the backup?" He said quickly, "No," I answered. That pause said enough. He reached for my arm and said, "Please talk to me." I stepped back and said, "Don't touch me." That night my phone rang again. A soft voice said, "This is Clara." I hesitated and replied, "Ethan's sister?" She said, "Yes." I asked, "Why are you calling?" She sighed and said, "I'm sorry." I said. That's not yours to carry. She answered. I knew about Lena. My heart dropped. I whispered. And you stayed silent? She said. I was wrong. I closed my eyes and said, you were. She added. Ethan ruined his life. I replied. He chose it. Clara continued. Lena left town. I asked, running? She said, everyone knows now. I laughed bitterly and said, she hated being seen. Clara said, Ethan drinks too much. I answered, that's not my concern. She paused and said, I wanted you to know the truth. I replied, the truth already hurt me. She whispered, I hope you heal. I said, I'm trying. I sat alone and said out loud, karma takes its time. My phone buzzed. Ethan texted, I can't sleep. I replied to the screen, neither could I. I didn't send it. He wrote, I ruined everything. I whispered, yes, you did. My chest burned with anger and relief. I asked myself, do I want closure? The answer scared me. Closure felt like reopening wounds. The next day, Ethan appeared again and said, can we talk calmly? I answered, I am calm. He said, you sound cold. I replied, pain changes temperature. He said, I never stopped loving you. I laughed and said, love doesn't betray. He said, I hate myself. I answered, that won't fix me. He asked, what do you want? I said, peace. He whispered, without me. I replied, especially without you. Later Mara called and said, you okay? I answered, I'm angry and clear. She said, that's powerful. I believed her. I thought about Lena and said, she built lies. I thought about Ethan and said, he destroyed himself. I realized karma didn't crash like thunder. It waited quiet and patient. That night, Clara texted, thank you for answering. I replied, take care. I put my phone down and said, I don't need revenge. I paused and added, I need distance. The past had clawed back into my life, but it didn't own me. I whispered, I survived betrayal. The words felt solid. I finally understood that karma wasn't about punishment. It was about truth catching up, slowly, inevitably, and leaving me free while they stood trapped inside the choices they made alone. I stared at my laptop and said, one post could end them. Mara leaned back in her chair and asked, would it heal you? I hesitated and replied, it would feel fair. She shook her head and said, fair isn't always freeing. I sighed and whispered, I want them to hurt. Mara answered, they already are. I asked, then why am I still angry? She said, because anger lingers when you delay choosing yourself. That night, Noah noticed my silence and said, you're loud when you're thinking. I looked at him and asked, what if I destroy them? He replied, would that build you? I frowned and said, they deserve consequences. He nodded and said, and you deserve peace. I asked, can I have both? He answered, only if peace comes first. His calm made me uncomfortable. I met my therapist and said, I feel weak for not fighting back. She replied, restraint is not weakness. I asked, then why does it feel like losing? She said, because you're used to measuring power through pain. I swallowed and said, I don't want to be bitter. She smiled and replied, then choose differently. I left feeling lighter and terrified. At work, Mr. Harlan called and said, your performance is excellent. I replied, I've been focused. He said, keep building that. I hung up and whispered, this is mine. The thought felt new. I updated my resume and said, I earned this. My hand stopped shaking. Later, Ethan texted, why won't you answer? I stared at the screen and said, because silence is my boundary. He wrote, I need closure. I replied to the air, so do I. I deleted the message thread and felt a strange relief. I wasn't cruel. I was done. Mara called and said, did you post anything? I answered, no. She asked, how do you feel? I paused and said, powerful. She laughed and replied, that's growth. I believed her. I realized revenge kept me tied to them. Letting go cut the rope. Noah and I walked one evening and he said, you seem steadier. I answered, I stopped waiting. He asked, "For what?" I said, "Apologies that won't fix anything." He nodded and said, "That's clarity." I looked at the city lights and said, "I'm building something new." He replied, "I can see that." I sat alone later and said, "Justice doesn't need an audience." My reflection looked back calmer. I thought about Lena and Ethan and said, "Your story isn't mine anymore." Fear whispered, "What if you regret mercy?" I answered, "Mercy is choosing myself." I booked another therapy session and said, "I want to keep growing." I signed up for a certification and said, "I'm capable." Each decision stacked strength inside me. I wasn't healed, but I was moving forward on purpose. Before sleeping, I whispered, "I choose me." The words felt solid. I understood then that revenge would keep me looking back, but strength demanded vision. I closed my eyes knowing my future would be built with discipline, self-respect, and distance, and that choosing myself was not surrender but the bravest fight I had ever won alone. I didn't go looking for updates, but they found me anyway. Mara called and said, "Have you heard?" I answered, "Heard what?" She hesitated and replied, "Ethan was removed from his project." I closed my eyes and said, "That was his dream job." She answered softly, "Not anymore." I felt a strange pull in my chest and whispered, "I didn't cause that." Mara said, "No, he did." Later, I ran into Daniel at lunch. Mara introduced us and said, "This is my friend." Daniel smiled and said, "Nice to meet you." He added casually, "I just finished a messy case." I asked, "Messy how?" He replied, "A corporate misconduct situation." I froze as he continued, "A guy named Ethan was involved." My heart skipped. I asked, "What happened?" He shrugged and said, "Poor judgment caught up with him." I nodded and said, "That happens." Daniel went on, "His reputation took a hit." I stirred my drink and said, "Reputations are fragile." He laughed and replied, "Especially when built on lies." The word hit me hard. Mara glanced at me, but I kept my face calm. Daniel said, "I've seen this pattern before." I answered, "People think they can outrun consequences." He replied, "They never do." I didn't smile, but something inside me loosened. That evening, Noah noticed my quiet mood and asked, "Heavy thoughts?" I answered, "The past is loud today." He said, "Do you want to talk?" I shook my head and replied, "I just need to listen." He nodded and said, "I'll sit with you." His presence grounded me. I said, "I'm not happy about it." He asked, "About what?" I said, "Watching them fall." He replied, "But you're not sad either." I admitted, "No." My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. A shaky voice said, "It's Lena." I swallowed and said, "Why are you calling me?" She said, "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." I laughed quietly and replied, "Now." She cried. Everything fell apart. I asked, "Because you were seen?" She said, "People hate me." I answered, "People hate lies." She whispered, "Ethan blames me." I said, "You both made choices." She hung up. I sat in silence and asked myself, "Do I feel guilty?" The answer surprised me. I said out loud, "No." Then I added, "I feel relieved." The relief scared me. I questioned, "Does that make me cruel?" I answered, "No, it makes me human." I hadn't pushed them. I hadn't exposed them. I had simply stepped aside and let truth do its work. Mara texted later, "You okay?" I replied, "I'm processing." She wrote, "It's okay to feel satisfied." I stared at the words and said, "I didn't plan this." She responded, "You didn't need to." I realized karma didn't need my hands. It moved on its own timeline. The next day, Daniel mentioned, "That case might get worse." I nodded and said, "Some lessons repeat until learned." He laughed and replied, "Exactly." He didn't know who I was to Ethan, and I didn't tell him. I didn't need witnesses to my strength. I walked home and said to myself, "The power has shifted." I wasn't watching from hope or hate. I was watching from distance. Their world cracked because it was built wrong. Mine stood because I rebuilt it honestly. That night I whispered, "I'm free." The words felt earned. I understood then that karma wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and fair. And for the first time, I wasn't standing in the wreckage. I was watching the dust settle from far away, steady, untouched, and finally stronger than the past that once owned me. I stood in the meeting room and said, "I'll lead the presentation." The room went quiet. Mr. Harlan looked at me and replied, "Are you ready?" I met his eyes and said, "Yes." He nodded and said, "Then do it." When I finished, a colleague said, "That was sharp." Another added, "You owned the room." I smiled and said, "Thank you." The confidence in my voice surprised me. After work, Mara called and said, "You sound different." I asked, "Different how?" She laughed and replied, "Stronger." I said, "I stopped shrinking." She answered, "I'm proud of you." I let the words sink in. I didn't deflect them. I said, "I am too." That felt new. Later, Noah noticed my mood and said, "You look lighter." I replied, "I feel steadier." He asked, "What changed?" I thought and said, "I trust myself now." He smiled and replied, "That's important." We walked quietly. I didn't fill the silence with fear anymore. I let it exist. At home, I looked at my reflection and said, "You survived." I remembered the woman who begged for honesty and whispered, "You were brave." I added, "But you were afraid." The woman staring back felt calmer. I said, "I'm not her anymore." The words didn't erase the past, but they softened it. Noah made tea and asked, "Do you want sugar?" I answered, "No." He raised an eyebrow and said, "You always used to." I paused and replied, "I changed." He smiled gently and said, "I see that." I felt warmth without expectation. I didn't owe him trust. He didn't demand it. The next morning, Mr. Harlan stopped by and said, "You've earned respect here." I replied, "I worked hard." He said, "And it shows." I nodded and answered, "I'm not done." He smiled and said, "Good." His words felt like recognition, not approval I had to chase. I sat alone during lunch and said to myself, "You don't need permission." I thought about Ethan and Lena and said, "You don't define me." The anger wasn't sharp anymore. It felt distant. I realized I wasn't proving anything. I was building something. That evening, Noah said, "You're quiet again." I replied, "Thinking." He asked, "Good thoughts?" I said, "Honest ones." He nodded and said, "Those matter." I hesitated and added, "I'm still guarded." He answered, "That's okay." His patience didn't scare me. It grounded me. I compared who I was to who I am. I used to say, "Please choose me." Now I say, "I choose myself." I used to apologize for wanting more. Now I say, "I deserve it." I said these things out loud, letting them settle. Mara texted, "Celebration soon?" I replied, "For what?" She answered, "For you." I smiled and said, "Yes." I didn't downplay it. I didn't feel guilty for winning quietly. Before bed, I told myself, "This is rebirth." Not loud, not dramatic. Just steady. I said, "I didn't rise to hurt anyone." I paused and added, "I rose to honor myself." My heart felt calm. I understood then that strength wasn't revenge or pride. It was self-worth built daily, protected fiercely, and carried forward without needing the past to bleed anymore. I was leaving the cafe when I heard a voice behind me. "Please wait." I turned slowly and said, "I can't." He stepped closer and said, "I need to say this." I froze. "About what?" He swallowed and replied, "Everything I ruined." I asked, "You mean our life?" He nodded and said, "I was wrong." I looked at him and said quietly, "You were." Ethan's eyes were red and he whispered, "I never stopped thinking about you." I kept my voice calm and said, "Thinking doesn't undo betrayal." He ran a hand through his hair and said, "I hurt you more than I can bear." I replied, "And I survived it." He looked down and said, "I hate what I did." I nodded and said, "I understand." The words surprised even me. He stepped closer and asked, "Can we talk?" "Really talk?" I shook my head and said, "I don't need closure from you." He faltered and asked, "Do you hate me?" I answered, "I don't hate you. That's yours to carry." He whispered, "I deserved forgiveness." I said, maybe you do. Just not from me. His lips trembled, but he didn't argue. I noticed the weight in his shoulders. I asked, is Lena out of your life now? He nodded. She left. I raised an eyebrow and said, and now you see what you lost. He looked at me and said, I see it every day. I replied, good. You should. My voice stayed steady, but inside, I felt a strange mix of relief and pity. He swallowed hard and said, I can't fix this. I nodded. No. You can't. He whispered, I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it. I said softly, then live it. He flinched but didn't move. I said, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to exist beyond you. He closed his eyes and whispered, I was selfish. I said, you were. And you are accountable. Ethan tried once more. Please let me explain everything. I shook my head and said, explanations don't rebuild trust. He said, I loved you. I replied, love doesn't excuse lies. He looked crushed. I said, I've grown past needing your validation. The words felt heavier than I expected. He nodded slowly. He stepped back and said, I wish I could undo it. I smiled faintly and said, wishing won't change the past. He whispered, I was blind. I said, and now you see. Silence stretched between us. I realized his regret no longer had power over me. I was calm, steady, free. Before walking away, I said, I hope you learn to live with this. He whispered, I hope you can forgive. I shook my head and said, not necessary. I just hope I never have to see you again. He nodded, understanding. I took a deep breath and stepped into the street. The irony didn't escape me. Lena was gone, he was broken, and I was untouched. I didn't forgive him, I didn't hate him. I just let him exist in the past while I moved into my future, whole and unshakable. I opened the drawer and pulled out a stack of letters. I whispered, so many words I'll never read again. I held the first one and said aloud, you meant everything to me once. I tore it slowly and dropped it in the trash. Another letter followed. I trusted you, I said, letting it fall. Each letter felt heavier until my chest finally eased. I found a photo album. I flipped through it and said, we dreamed too loudly. I paused on a picture of us laughing. You won't haunt me anymore, I whispered, closing the book. The air felt lighter. I placed the album in a box marked past, and I smiled faintly. Goodbye, I said. Noah knocked and said, you okay? I answered, better than okay. He leaned against the doorway and asked, need help? I shook my head. I need this alone, I said. He nodded and replied, I'll be here when you're ready. I felt warmth without obligation. I walked to the balcony and held the wind on my face. I won't look back, I whispered. Noah appeared beside me and said, you've changed. I replied, I had to. He smiled and said, it shows. I added, it feels like I can breathe. He said softly, then keep breathing. I nodded. I picked up a small necklace Ethan gave me and stared at it. This was love once, I said. I set it on the railing and let it slip into the night. Noah said, letting go is hard. I replied, it's necessary. He didn't comment, just stood there with me. His presence was steady, not demanding. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of years lift. Inside, I opened my journal and wrote, no more regrets. I read it aloud. No more bitterness. No more shadows of what I lost. Each word felt like fire burning the remnants of pain. Noah peeked over my shoulder and said, that's brave. I smiled faintly and said, I'm learning. I found a box of keepsakes and whispered, memories can stay without controlling me. I let each item rest in the box, placing it on the shelf. I said, I choose peace. My hand shook but my heart felt lighter. I didn't need revenge, letters, or apologies to complete me. Later, Noah asked, are you scared of the future? I answered, a little. He said, that's normal. I smiled and replied, then I'll step forward anyway. He nodded, saying nothing more. I realized companionship didn't require promises, just presence. That alone was enough. I walked through the apartment, touching familiar walls. This is mine again, I whispered. Each step felt deliberate. I stopped in front of the window and said, I survived and I'm free. Noah leaned close and said softly, "You've earned it." I nodded, letting the city lights witness my rebirth. I let the past remain behind me, untouched, silent and finally powerless, while I stood ready to embrace whatever came next. I stood in front of the mirror and said, "You've come a long way." My reflection didn't flinch. I whispered, "I am not her anymore." The woman staring back carried scars, but they didn't define me. I touched my face and said, "I survived everything." The words felt solid like the first step out of a shadow. Noah knocked lightly and said, "Still talking to yourself?" I laughed and replied, "Yes. Someone needs to witness growth." He smiled and said, "I see it." I nodded and said, "I feel it too." He leaned on the doorway and added, "You shine differently." I paused and whispered, "I'm finally standing in my own light." At work, Mara called and said, "You handled that project brilliantly." I smiled and said, "I did it my way." She laughed and replied, "And no one could touch you." I said, "Exactly. I'm not afraid anymore." She added, "That's freedom." I felt the word in my chest, heavy but comforting. I walked outside and felt the sun on my skin. I whispered, "I am not my past." Noah followed silently and asked, "Do you ever fear it?" I shook my head and said, "It exists but it doesn't own me." He nodded and said, "You've rebuilt everything." I smiled faintly and replied, "Not everything, just what matters." I remembered nights of tears, moments I questioned my worth. I whispered, "Those nights made me strong." Noah said softly, "Strength looks good on you." I answered, "It feels good too." The city around me felt smaller, gentler, as if it recognized the woman I had become. I felt steady, grounded, unshakable. I paused by the cafe we first met and said, "I'm not the same girl who believed too easily." Noah smiled and asked, "Do you miss her?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "She taught me, but she doesn't live here anymore." I felt release in my chest, a calm that had been foreign for years. Back at home, I opened my journal and wrote, "I define myself." I read it aloud. Not betrayal, not loss, not broken promises. I am me. Noah peeked over my shoulder and said, "You're proud." I replied, "I finally can be." I traced my fingers across the page and whispered, "All of this is mine." That evening, I stood by the window and watched the city lights. I said, "The power has shifted." It wasn't revenge, guilt, or anger. It was me. I felt it in my chest, steady and warm. Noah asked, "Do you ever regret the pain?" I answered, "It shaped me, but it doesn't control me." He nodded. I finally whispered to myself, "I am whole." I felt it in my bones. I had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and disappointment, and emerged stronger, brighter, and clear. I turned to Noah and said, "I stand in my own light now." He smiled softly, and I knew it was true. I didn't need anyone else to recognize it. I did. The past had lost its grip, and I had found my power, unshakable and entirely my own. I woke up to sunlight spilling through the curtains and whispered, "I am awake. I am here." The room felt calm, and for the first time in years I didn't reach for a phone, a message, or a memory. I said softly, "I belong to myself now." Noah appeared in the doorway and asked, "Good morning." I smiled and said, "Yes, good morning." He nodded and said, "You seem lighter." I laughed quietly. "I feel it too." I made coffee and whispered to the steam rising from the cup, "I didn't need revenge to win." Noah leaned on the counter and said, "You already have everything that matters." I replied, "Everything except the past's control." He nodded and said, "It's gone, isn't it?" I smiled. "Completely." I felt my chest expand with relief and pride. I wasn't haunted anymore. My phone buzzed. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. I stared and said, "This doesn't belong to me anymore." I swiped it away without hesitation. He would remain in his regret, trapped by the choices he had made. I whispered, "I chose freedom instead." No guilt, no second guessing. Just clarity. I walked outside and felt the wind on my face. I said aloud, "I am not the woman they broke." I thought of Lena, of promises, of nights spent crying alone, and I said, "I am stronger than all of it." Noah joined me silently. He didn't need words. His presence was steady, grounding. I said, I am ready for what comes next. He smiled softly. And you will handle it. I nodded. I will. At work, Mr. Harlan called and said, You've grown so much. I replied, I've learned to value myself. He said, That's power. I laughed quietly. Power without bitterness. He agreed. The acknowledgement felt good, but I didn't need it to know my worth. I said to myself, I define myself now. Later, Mara texted, How are you feeling? I replied, free, calm, alive. She wrote back, I knew you would rise. I whispered, Not rise over anyone, over myself. The thought felt light. I didn't need apologies, confessions, or justice from them. I had found my own. Noah asked, Do you ever think about them? I shook my head and said, Only to know I'm past it. He said, Then nothing can touch you. I smiled faintly. Nothing ever will. I felt the truth in it. I had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and disappointment, and I had grown through it instead of letting it destroy me. That evening I stood on the balcony, looking at the city lights. I said, I am whole. I traced my fingers along the railing and whispered, I didn't win by hurting him. I won by choosing myself. The night air carried my words away, but I didn't need anyone to hear them. They were mine. I turned to Noah and said, I feel ready for life. He smiled and said, Then go forward. I nodded and whispered, I will. The past stayed behind me, quiet and powerless. I was free, alive, and fully myself. I had been broken, but I had been reborn. I said softly, This is my justice, my life, my rebirth. The city lights reflected in my eyes, and I knew I would never let anyone dim them again.